Welcome everyone to this SEA20 call, where today we'll be focusing on maritime energy transition and future fuels. My name is Anu Partanen. I work as director at Nordic West Office, and Nordic West Office is in charge of coordinating this SEA20 initiative. I'll be moderating the discussion, so first things first, let's do a few housekeeping rules. Let's try to keep our microphones muted. As a moderator, I in fact just clicked on mute everyone's microphones, so don't be surprised if that happened. It's nothing personal. We'll just try to keep microphones muted when people are not speaking, so there's no extra sound. You can raise your hand always on Teams to ask for a turn to speak. We certainly welcome questions and comments along the way. The whole point of the call is to be a conversation. We'd also like to record this call and possibly share it publicly afterwards, but only if everyone attending this call agrees. So if you do not wish to be on a recording that will be published, just let us know on the chat. We have, I believe, included, or we will include, the contact info. Yes, if you scroll up the chat, you can see that Jenni Hilska has shared the info where you can send an email just if you feel like you don't want to be part of a public recording. Let's take a look at the agenda. I think we have the next slide. We can see our speakers today. So we have 4 distinguished speakers who will be giving short 5 to 10 minute presentations. We've left time for a Q&A towards the end of the call, but of course along the way, please feel welcome to either raise your hand or post questions on chat. I will keep an eye on the chat and we can bring questions and comments to our speakers as we go along. But first, I'd like to invite Risto E.J. Benttila on behalf of Nordic West Office to say opening words and perhaps say a few words about the SEA20 initiative. Welcome, Risto. It is possible, of course, that I also muted Risto now. So Risto, if
yes,
you yes, sorry about that.
Thank you, Adam, for releasing me. Welcome everyone on my behalf, and wonderful to have you. It's good to be back in business after we all took a break with the COVID situation. As a chief coordinator of the initiative, I'd just like to say a few words of where we are today and how we intend to go forward. So our goal was, as the SEA20 initiative, to connect 20 leading maritime cities by the end of 2020. And I'm happy to report that, yes, indeed, the mission is accomplished. And the SEA20 initiative today has connected more than 20 cities. And not only that, but also a number of other relevant, very important actors committed to a smarter and a more sustainable maritime future. And there are examples of these actors, cities, ports, universities, international organizations, corporations, industry actors, networks of like-minded organizations that you will see on the slide there. And the question, of course, is how did we get here? And I have to admit that we did so by changing our approach. When we started before the COVID situation, we set out as a membership organization emphasizing physical meetings. But then, of course, the world changed and we decided that the way we are going to work is as a loose network, a coalition of the willing, a coalition of the interested, and instead of physical meetings, of course, virtual meetings. And indeed, thanks very much for taking part in these calls. It's an important way to keep the momentum going towards next year. Thank you very much, Wärtsilä, for making this call and our initiative possible once again. So this is all I wanted to share with us as a loose network of like-minded organizations. It's wonderful to share ideas. And today, as Anu pointed out, we have a very good menu for you. So Anu will say a few words at the end about how we intend to go forward next year, but we intend to continue with these calls. And be looking very much at decarbonization in the maritime sector. But that's all from me now, and back to you, Anu.
Thank you, Risto. And so in addition to our speakers, I'm happy to see that we really have participants on this call from places far and wide in the world, including people from the United States, Canada, China, Panama, Singapore, South Africa, and various European countries. So welcome, everyone. And I imagine we can have a lively conversation from different perspectives. Let's go to our first speaker. I would like to welcome Michele Acciaro, Director at the Hapag-Lloyd Center for Shipping and Global Logistics. Welcome, Michele. Do we have Michele muted? I saw him earlier.
Thank you very much, Anu. First of all, I would like to thank the Nordic West Office and the SEA20 initiative for the invitation to speak in this call, because of course it's an honor to be part of this network, and I am really excited in talking to you about decarbonizing shipping and how we actually using alternative fuels can maybe achieve more of this. So hello from Hamburg, from my side as well, and I will be discussing briefly a couple of points about the options related to alternative fuels and also what sort of policy instruments are there in place. If you move to the next slide, please. I think it's important to highlight that we are facing an enormous challenge. Obviously, we are all familiar with how large the challenge of climate change is on our societies, but of course also for shipping, this is an enormous challenge. And this is a challenge that makes it very exciting to be working in shipping these days. We had just over the summer the 4th IMO greenhouse gas study that was published, which confirmed the importance of international shipping in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, also from a European perspective, where I am based, maritime transport is very critical and is being addressed very importantly as part of the decarbonization strategy that we have in Europe, especially with the upcoming European climate law and a set of various other initiatives. We have to consider also, and that is one of the aspects that is very relevant when we're talking about shipping or transport, is that while through other modes of with other industries, we have somehow promising technologies already in place and the possibility to, with a certain degree of comfort, to look at substantial reduction in emissions because of the intrinsic growth that we observe in transportation, both of goods but also of passengers. It's going to be very challenging to combine the growth in the sector together with the emissions reduction. And I think this is very clear if you look at the savings that have been observed in the last years, where we had, for example, in the last 10 years, emissions reduction in the container sector of about 18%. But these emissions have not really been transformed or become visible in the reduction in the emissions of the sector, which has been much more limited. And that is because we have, of course, growth in the number of ships and growth in the number of trade and transportation that is taking place. So this big challenge, both from Europe but also for the world, requires us to actually look at ambitious targets. And I think in Europe, just last week, the European Council confirmed that we will commit to a 55% reduction on a 1990 basis by 2030. And this is simply an additional confirmation on the target of carbon neutrality that has been set up at a European level. And when it comes down to transport, to reducing emission by 90% by 2050. This is also associated with the IMO goal and initial strategy that I'm sure John will maybe touch upon later on, which of course has the objective of reducing emissions of at least 50% by 2050 in absolute terms. Now, this enormous challenge requires us to take all the instruments that we have available, and a very important role is going to be played by alternative fuels. So next slide, please. We have an enormous variety of alternative fuels, although as today the majority of fuel are being, or the majority of ships are running on diesel, but we have of course a lot of other options that are becoming, from a technological point of view, more and more mature. Of course, we have still fossil fuels that will be available, but they will be probably complemented by the development of biofuels. We had enormous developments in the area of liquefied natural gas. And of course, as natural gas is a fossil fuel, in order to really meet the requirements of carbon emissions reduction, we will probably need to tap in biogas or syngas. And we have also other alternatives of maybe less common fuels in shipping, such as methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen, which of course offers a lot of interesting options, especially because of their low emissions, especially ammonia and hydrogen, or zero emissions in the actual burning of the fuel. But they raise a lot of issues related to actually how these fuels are produced. And that's why it's very important to consider what actually the pathways of production of these fuels are. In a recent study that we discussed at the European Sustainable Shipping Forum, where I am a member, we saw a very interesting mapping of all the potential pathways of fuels carried out by Maritime. And there they identified 53 different pathways, which combine different typologies of engines with different typologies of feedstock and different type of fuels. And that, of course, confirms the complexity of what actually is coming towards us. I have identified 4 key issues which I think needs to be addressed when discussing alternative fuels. I stay away from the technology, although of course some of those fuels are reaching adequate levels of maturity, but there are substantial differences there still. We also have the issue of autonomy. Some of those fuels, because of the different volumes that are required to produce a similar energy that we have today, impose constraints on the autonomy of vessels. And that, of course, for vessels that are sailing across the oceans is a very important issue. And we have still important operational issues that needs to be resolved in terms of guidelines, crewing, insurances. We also have uncertainty in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions of those fuels. So as I mentioned before, it's extremely critical, and the differences can be enormous. It's extremely critical to look at the emissions on tank to propeller and well to propeller, and also going beyond that, and what is the fuel life cycle of the fuels. We also have the very important issue of cost, which I would say at this point is probably one of the most critical that needs to be resolved, both in terms of CapEx, but also very important on OpEx, which relate to the difference between those fuels and the various alternatives. And of course, also what will be the impact of policy in terms, for example, of emission trading schemes or bunker fuels or support and subsidies that might be provided for the fuel transition. And last but not least, we have the issue of availability, which relates not only to the infrastructure at port, and I'm sure that later on we will hear something more from Antonis, but also in terms of competitions with other modes of transport and the availability of feedstock, and also how these fuels will be prioritized in the pursuit of the national emission targets. For example, as maritime transport generally falls outside the scope of national emission commitments, it is likely that some fuels will be probably given preferential use within those modes of transport of those users, which can be counted for into the national emission targets. If we go to the next slide, please, you see here, again, a reiteration of the efforts that have been done at a European level. And I think this is representative of the very ambitious target that have been set up in other contexts. And on the slides on the right, I am trying to outline some of the key issues. I'm sorry that in the translation of the slides, some of the titles are not readable anymore, but the first block on top says energy efficiency, while the second block says alternative fuels. We have the possibility of reaching this emissions reduction by focusing on energy efficiency and alternative fuels. There are more issues, but what this confirms is that in order to incentivize decarbonization, we need to look at multiple issues at the same time. And for these multiple issues, we'll probably will be required to have a basket of measures, to use the words of Timmermans in a reply in the European Parliament of how to decarbonize shipping. And this comes together with efforts which are coming at a global level through the IMO, which is and should be the preferred way of actually imposing regulation on the sector. And this, of course, recently we had the MEPC meeting last week with a discussion on the EEXI and the CII indexes, in addition to the already very ambitious targets set up for the EDI. But of course, also when it comes to alternative fuels, we need to do various issues. We have the Alternative Fuel Directive, which is of course an important instrument, and of course also being discussed and further developed the Refuel EU Maritime Initiative, which tends to address how to incentivize the use of demand. Of course, we also have on the pillars on the right and the left-hand side in the blue boxes, both the monitoring and enforcement, which is very important, as well as research and innovation policy and support for transition, which is also new technologies, which is also very relevant. If we go to the next slide, please. Just a few words to confirm the importance of what we are doing when we are talking about interfering or facilitating a fuel transition in shipping. It is important not only because of the relative weight that maritime transport has on emissions, but also because, of course, maritime transport is one of the fundamental pillars of globalizations, and everything we do has an impact on trade costs, and this can have enormous implications for the well-being of countries, especially developing economies and least developed countries. On this, we also have to consider issues of insularity and remoteness, which are relevant not only within the world, but also within Europe. And if you look on the slide I put in here, even the EU is extremely vulnerable to global demand and supply shocks. And there are studies. I saw a modeling study, for example, where we had an increase of 10% in trade cost would result in enormous reductions in export, up to 40%, according to some scenarios. Of course, hopefully, decarbonization will not impose such large shares of additional cost, but it is important to address how this cost will also be perceived and how to minimize this cost. So we should avoid inefficiency, and we should make sure that policy is effective. And that's why it's important to ensure that we are dealing and we are avoiding resistance to change. It's important to create consensus. It's important to develop fact-based policy, to have clear aims and objectives, ensure a just transition so that also we do not leave anybody behind. And I think the discussion at the European level last week really represented this when we're talking about transitioning also for economies that are more dependent on coal for their energy needs. And also we need, and that's very important, to have coherence of policy. Coherence over time in terms of long-term objectives, but also coherence at a national, regional, and global level. And that's why there is a very important role for the IMO and for the European Union and supranational governments and organizations to actually do this. Enforcement is a very critical issue and very important as well. And we need to account also what the consequence will be on supply chain, as well as avoiding at all cost incoherence, as incoherence causes inertia. And we have to consider that behind every policy decisions, there are investment decisions that needs to be carried out at the shipping level, but also at a port and infrastructure level. And taking the wrong decisions or giving the wrong policy signals carry a lot of weight, as obviously investment will be then carried out in the wrong areas. And this, of course, already reduces further already limited resources. And finally, last but not least, fragmentation is also resulting in higher cost and slow technology adoption. So it's very important at a policy level that we ensure and we try to minimize fragmented and incoherent and inconsistent approaches. That's all I wanted to share with you in this 10 minutes. I've gone probably a little bit over time, as it's my habit, but I apologize, I'm Italian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Acciaro. Since we have a little bit of a tight schedule, I propose that we keep moving and introduce our next speaker. And if anybody have questions or thoughts, you can hold them and ask them towards the end of the call when we have a Q&A, or you can type them in the chat now, and we will bring them to the Q&A session later. So our next speaker is Mr. Tham, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer and Senior Director at Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. And currently, Mr. Tham is in charge of planning and developing the next generation Port of Singapore. So we're very excited to have him with us. Welcome. I think I saw earlier that we do have Mr. Tham on the call. Perhaps you are muted.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity for us together here at SEA20 to reconnect and catch up with one another. I don't have slides to present, but basically there are some pointers that I would like to share with all of you what MPA is focusing on and what are some of our initiatives that we want to drive decarbonization in the maritime sector in Singapore. So to begin, I think 2020 has been a very challenging year so far because of COVID-19, and the economic repercussions have been far-reaching, as many of you are aware. So for the shipping industry, the disruption of global supply chains pose a serious threat in Singapore and throughout the world. So this COVID-19 recession plunged the global economy into one of the worst recessions where many jobs and livelihood have been affected thus far. We have seen over the months how pandemic had changed many of the processes in our daily lives, but one thing we should not change will be our focus on sustainability. While we tackle the immediate challenges of COVID-19 in Singapore, it also presents an opportunity for us, the government and the industries, to leave behind business as usual mindsets and transit into a new normal that will be more sustainable. And this complements the aggressive transformation of the Port of Singapore, right, which can be described with 3 Ds, right? Disruption, first one, digitalization, and decarbonization. So the first D is disruption. Now, as we all know, trade patterns are shifting rapidly. New business models, additive manufacturing, new vulnerabilities such as cyber attacks are emerging. So disruption can also be in a form of emerging technology such as 3D printing, which could potentially be a game changer. So the question is, are we ready to disrupt rather than be disrupted? And no one would have expected disruption to come in the form of global COVID-19 pandemic. So the second D is digitalization. Now, as we move towards Industry 4.0, we need greater digitalization and harmonization of data in the maritime supply chain. And this digital revolution not only reduces human interactions, but also allows shipping to yield a new level of efficiency. So in MPA, one of the initiatives that we have embarked on is the development of digital oceans. It is envisioned to be an interoperable platform and information hub that facilitates cross-border data exchange and automate services across supply chain players, clearance authorities, and other national single windows. So digital oceans can allow ships, ports, and global trade platforms to share data and work seamlessly with each other. So this allows us to commit to common data exchange protocols and connect isolated data lakes. This will lead to more efficient voyages, resulting in lower emissions. So we are already working with industry partners and will be aiming to bring in port authorities for greater collaboration. The third D we are focusing on is, of course, decarbonization. And decarbonization can be considered the crux of our sustainable development and climate change agenda in Singapore. Now, as a small, low-lying city-state, Singapore is particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and tackling it is a matter of national priority. So we need to appreciate the gravity of the situation that we face. And by year 2100, mean sea level around us could rise for more than 1 meter due to polar ice melt. So at high tides, the water can rise as high as 2 meters above mean sea level. And if we take into account storms and tide and even surges, sea levels can rise even further. So as part of our decarbonization efforts, right, our MPA recognized the value of partnerships among countries, industries, and academia. So therefore, we have to set up an international advisory panel to tap on the knowledge and expertise of local and international experts. Well, we have also launched a $40 million Maritime Green Future Fund to create ecosystems of trials and test bedding of low carbon technologies. We cannot rest on our laurels, and we should continue to build on this collaborative spirit to accelerate the trials and adoption of more efficient and greener technologies for shipping. So this circle of collaboration together with IMO will allow us to bring ports, industries, and governments together to share the knowledge of our findings and allow us to commit to some concrete actions moving forward. Now, recently, MPA, together with the Port of Rotterdam Authority and the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, Japan, recently signed a memorandum of cooperation to form what we call a future fuels port network. This port network will align the efforts of signatory partners in driving the development of new fuels across participating ports. Under this MOC, parties will undertake the development of a roadmap detailing the adoption of clean marine fuels in support of decarbonization. So besides research and development, parties will work on possible joint bunkering pilot runs with identified shipping lines to help us meet our emission targets. Next is also on the LNG. Now, LNG serves as a viable and clean transitional marine fuel to help us meet IMO's greenhouse gas emission target. And Singapore has co-developed standards and procedures for LNG bunkering, including safe simultaneous operations, or SIMOPS in short, with industries and government partners. To date, we have safely conducted more than 270 truck-to-ship LNG bunkering operations. And Singapore, in the near future, will have an LNG bunkering supply capacity of up to 1 million tons per annum from 2021. So this quantity actually translates to about 300 ship-to-ship LNG bunkering operations annually. And to facilitate regular ship-to-ship LNG bunkering in the Port of Singapore, 2 MPA co-funded LNG bunker vessels will be delivered to Singapore by 2021. And furthermore, MPA have also launched a request for proposal to issue additional LNG bunker supply licenses to support the growing demand of LNG bunkers in Singapore. Complementing the recent joint call for proposals on the electrification of hovercraft by MPA and the Singapore Maritime Institute, MPA and SMI, in short, commenced the biofuel compatibility study for Singapore hovercraft, and led by the NTUs, which is one of the Institute of Higher Learning in Singapore, Maritime Energy and Sustainable Development Center of Excellence. The study focuses on alternative energy sources for Singapore's hovercraft sector. This study will examine the environmental, technical, operational, and economic viability of bunkering biofuels. It is part of MPA's R&D efforts to study alternative marine fuels and energy decarbonization process, such as electrification and onboard carbon capture. As part of our decarbonization efforts, we are also concerned about how our port and terminal operators generate carbon emissions and the type of fuel they use. So I'm heartened with the fact that our port operators, PSA and Jurong Port, have been working very closely with my team to ensure that they reach the sustainability targets. Some of the efforts include the installation of solar panels, which has already have an annual generation capability of more than 12 million kilowatt hours of solar energy. And also the electrification of our port terminal equipment as they shift their operation to a new transport come 2021. Now, moving forward, there is a growing need for new talent, right? Not to forget about that. And compared to other sectors, the maritime sector remains resilient. And it is an exciting time now for industry transformation where new jobs can be created and to attract new talent to the industry in emerging areas such as data analytics, robotics, automation, and even green energy, engineering. And climate change is a problem we cannot solve alone. So we need the help of all of you to move global climate change needle. So as a maritime nation, Singapore is totally and fully committed to promote the environmental sustainability of the maritime industry. Hence, I would like to invite like-minded partners like yourself here to come on board and join us on development and supply of clean marine fuels to reduce the impact of shipping on the environment. All right, Maritime or MPA see many opportunities in the maritime sector, and we thank all our partners for coming on board to create a win-win outcomes. And I look forward to hearing many of your feedbacks on what more we can do so in Singapore that we can learn from one another for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would again sort of suggest that at this point we move to our next speaker, and everybody keep their questions in mind, and we'll get back to them at the Q&A or type them in the chat. Next, we have Dr. John Calleya, Technical Officer from the International Maritime Organization. John, you are with us. Did I butcher your last name? How do you pronounce it?
Calleya.
Calleya. Okay, good. Welcome. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. So I've actually been at the IMO for a couple of years now, basically I'm responsible for the EDI data collection system, and I've been looking at, well, I basically did a PhD looking at reducing emissions from ships. And then I kind of got more involved at the IMO and ended up working at the IMO a couple of years ago. Thanks very much. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is a very, very short presentation. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the IMO GHG study. I'm going to talk about the IMO initial strategy in reduction of GHG emissions from ships, and then I'm going to finish on one slide to kind of summarize the potential future landscape for fuels in shipping, based on what the discussion and what's going on at the IMO and what we see going on as well in the industry. Next slide, please. So the fourth IMO GHG study was approved MEPC 75, and it's a really in-depth study. But if you had to try and summarize it in one slide, it might be something like this. And similar to previous studies, it shows that if we carry on business as usual, then emissions are set to increase. Basically, this graph shows what they will increase to in the future. And the other one of the key things we look at is how the share of global CO2 emissions changes for shipping and other industries. So it's gone from 2.77% in 2012 to 2.89% in 2018. Next slide, please. So in 2018, the initial IMO GHG study was adopted. This was actually quite a monumental piece of legislation because it explains what the IMO is going to do to reduce CO2 emissions in shipping. Next slide, please. So what I've done here is I've just highlighted the key areas of that document that was adopted in 2018. And I've also highlighted the aspects to it that are talking about fuels. So you can see there, actually, there's a sentence there which mentions that in order to achieve the levels of ambition in the initial strategy, technological innovation and the global introduction of alternative fuels for international shipping will be integral to achieve the overall ambition. So it's a kind of clear recognition that the committee recognises that you do need to use alternative fuels if you want to meet the levels of ambition in the strategy. And the next two bits highlighted there, they show what the level ambitions are. And there's actually 3 different targets. So there's a target which is CO2 emissions per transport work. So this has to reduce by 40% by 2030, pursuing efforts towards 70%. And because it's a CO2 emissions per transport work, it's actually, individual ships have to improve by that 40%. The other target, which actually works out to be more stringent, is there's a target to reduce GHG emissions, annual GHG emissions by 50% by 2050, compared to 2008. Because this is a sector-wide target, it means, if the sector increases in future, which we do expect, then it means that individual ships will have to do more to keep that the increase in emissions, to meet the 50% target. Next slide, please. And the other thing about the initial strategy is that it has a plan for what's going to be discussed, and there's a list of candidate measures, which is not very legible, but it's just to kind of demonstrate all of the different options in there, and it's kind of like a list of things that the committee will discuss, could discuss or may discuss in the future. And the other thing, is that recently MEPC 75. The first part of this is short-term measures. So all of those different candidate measures are divided into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And the measures adopted at MEPC 75, they're short-term measures. So the draft amendments have been approved, and they're expected to be adopted at the next session, and they contain basically contain energy efficiency standards for the existing fleet. So before this, we had the EDI, but it was only for new ships. So this is having something for the existing fleet, which will be expected to come into force in 2023. There's still a lot more work behind this. You can see, this is only a very small part of this plan of work to be discussed by the committee, and it's in the longer term things that's when the committee is expected to start discussing things such as alternative fuels and guidelines for fuels in more detail. Also at MEPC 75, there was also a discussion on having a kind of carbon, a kind of additional charge to raise money on fuel sold, and then that money would go to a research board. So this was also something that was discussed, but it didn't, it isn't a mature discussion yet. That's still being discussed. So anyway, I've summarized a few things there, but there is a lot going on at the moment. A lot of discussion at IMO on this work, and this will carry on. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide kind of looks at, given the initial strategy and what we know about the different fuel options and what we see, what might happen in the future. The way the initial IMO GHG strategy works is it doesn't say you must use certain fuels. Ship owners or other stakeholders, they're allowed to pick whatever fuels they want as long as they can meet those different targets. So that's the kind of way the committee is thinking at the moment. So we are in a situation then that there are lots of different fuels that could be used to comply, providing you could be in line with the levels of ambition. And so we are seeing at the moment the future fuel mix for shipping is quite uncertain. And I think the previous presentation alluded to it as well. I mean, there's quite a number of different fuel options, and there's not really one clear fuel. I do think if you look at the moment fossil fuels, they're actually very cheap, and they're actually quite convenient to use and quite energy dense. And then we're trying to replace them with different options, and they all have different advantages and disadvantages. Some fuels are more harmful, for instance. Some fuels require particular storage. Most of the options are less energy dense. And what's happening today is we do see some ships, very few ships though, are using some fuels on a daily basis. We do see methanol in operation. In that case, it's actually because the company transports methanol, so they use it as a fuel. So there's probably only a handful of ships using these fuels today that are non-fossil fuels. But there is a lot of ongoing research. Hydrogen and ammonia are actually quite good because they have less CO2 emissions, but they're not ready yet. But they're currently under development and probably some years away. But there is a lot of research going on those. The other thing I just mentioned here is that battery power is quite an interesting one, because that's why why don't we just use battery power? Well, actually the batteries are not that energy dense for ocean-going ships. So we do see those solutions for small ships, but not for large ships. And batteries actually will take up very approximately like 35 times the space of diesel or HFO if you were to replace them with the same amount of energy. So you need to look for different solutions, and we are seeing at the moment, different fuels work better for different situations, and also it depends on where you get the fuel from, where you manufacture the fuel. Some countries are probably more suited to being able to manufacture renewable fuels, and then some countries, places like Brazil, they have a lot of ethanol, so for them, it's probably more likely that using biofuels is an option. So that's the other factor in the fuels and how they might be used is where they come from, the cost change.
John, sorry to jump in. Can I just ask you to start wrapping up so we can move ahead? I see many questions, so we'd like to have time for conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I was just about to finish. Yeah, so anyway, the last thing I just wanted to say is that actually, because ships have quite a long lifetime, so some of these considerations have to start happening now. It is hard to predict, but in the future we may get a shipping fleet that has a number of different fuel options like hydrogen, ammonia, batteries, sustainable biofuels. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you everyone for questions you're posting. I see some questions that I believe are about Singapore Port directed to Mr. Tham. A few are directed to John. So I'd suggest that we now move ahead to Juha. But of course, John and Tham, if you would like to, you could check on the chat a little bit the questions and see if we get to them after the next talk, which is by Juha Kytölä, bringing us industry perspective from Wärtsilä. Juha, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to present the input from Wärtsilä side. And if you go to next, then Wärtsilä is a company, technology company, developing, producing, and delivering technologies. Our purpose is to enable sustainable societies with smart technology. So we are really into looking how to make things sustainable. We do shipping or we are involved in shipping with delivering engines, propulsion systems, technology, also the automation, the controls, navigation, etc. We are also on land-based energy plants where we have similar needs nowadays than in shipping for the decarbonization. And our view is the life cycle focus. So next, please. Before going to the fuel side, I would echo what was said from the Singapore port as well. The challenge here and the developments are based on not only on the fuels and decarbonization, but also on digitalization. And here nicely, the digitalization is actually enabling not only developments on safety and savings, but the savings in this respect are linked to decarbonization as well. The fuel that we can save in shipping is helping economically the shipping, but also is saving the environment, less carbon emissions when using less of fuel, which comes then on the on-time arrival, synchronized logistics, predictive maintenance, and optimized manning, etc. So digitalization is important. But then let's go to the decarbonization with the fuel. So next, please. As already was said, and I repeat it in a simplified manner here, we are on the era where we are moving from fossil fuels forward and stepping not only perhaps at one step, but it can be also an era where we are making mixtures. We start to blend, decarbonize some part of the fossil fuels by mixing other fuels into it. Biofuels is a major trend coming, and also synthetic fuels through the availability of low-cost electricity from wind plants, solar plants, etc. So next page, please. Quickly jumping into what is available already today when we look into how to power ships. The technologies naturally are ready for utilizing fossil fuels, both fossil liquid fuels, but also fossil gas, natural gas in liquefied format storage on board of the ships. What is also available already is the choices of technologies for biofuels, for bio liquid fuels, but also for biogas. On land-based, we see rather much of bioliquid plants and some on biogas as well, and the same can be spread into shipping as well, and nicely mixing these together, like with natural gas, biogas, which is methane as well, can be mixed directly into the fuels to decarbonize already a part of the emissions there. Synthetic liquids and gas also are actually a choice today already. Synthetic methane produced with electricity from wind or solar actually is methane and mixes very well with the gas, whether it is natural gas or biogas or synthetic gas. Methane is methane. So we actually have technologies already, and in that respect, what we recommend to owners and operators choosing the gas path is actually securing choices which are future proven already for the future. But in addition to these fuels, as was also mentioned in the report from IMO or the presentation here, green methanol is one of those choices. Methanol is an alcohol. Ethanol could be in the same category. This is something where choices already exist for shipping, but unfortunately the availability of green methanol is very, very poor today, but it's expected also to be coming more and more, mostly thanks to bio or synthetic processes. And further on, under development, there are these fuel choices, fuels which do not contain carbon at all, ammonia and hydrogen. And like us, Wärtsilä, we have already technologies, and there are ship technology out in there for the methanol. For ammonia and hydrogen, we are doing research and development at the moment. Ammonia on full scale next year, and hydrogen in engine as well. When it comes to the market, it depends a lot on the feasibility and the customer needs expressed for these fuels. If the next slide, please. It looks, and it's likely, as was also mentioned, that in the future, there might not only be one fuel which is being used. Locally might be different mixes, but even regionally, there might be many. And we all actually are used to this already when fueling our cars. Next, please. The availability of the fuel is only one of the drivers, and the availability of the engine technology is only one. There are many aspects that they need to be looked upon in together. The fuel availability, the complex equation of the CapEx and OpEx, then what is best for the application, the complexity to manage some of these fuels. We know that some are even toxic, some of fuels, and some are risky in other respect, where solutions can be made, but needs to be included into the total equation. On shipping, the vessel structure needs to be taken into account. Some of these new fuels or candidate fuels do require rather much of larger capacity for the tanks, as an example. And then the shipyard capacity, because it is not only believed that new ships will start to use these new fuels. Also, there is a pressure and a need to retrofit and modify the current shipping. And not the engines only, but the auxiliary systems as well. So next, please. So we look into the total complete systems in Wärtsilä. And at the moment, we are working with all these fuels that were presented, since it is too early to say which one will be the winning path and which is the one that the societies and the environment need in order to meet these goals for decarbonization. But when looking different fuels, also options for fulfilling the whole function in the ship and the logistics is being looked upon. This completes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Juha. We have asked a few people to give very short comments, but before we go to those comments, I'd like to bring in a few of the questions here on chat. So perhaps we could start with the ones for Mr. Tham, if you are with us. Heidi Nilsson asked, in Singapore port, will the solar power be used for land infrastructure or be used to deliver shore power or to produce other fuels for ships like hydrogen? What types of fuels other than LNG will be available in Singapore port in 2025 and 2030? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the question is a good question. Thank you for the question. I think in Singapore, definitely, I think one of our multi-purpose port, which is Jurong Port, which handles bulk, break bulk and containerized cargo, actually installed a huge amount of solar panels, right? That uses renewable energy. And as I mentioned in my brief just now, it actually produces about 12 million kilowatt hours of solar energy a year, just to sustain, or rather to support its land infrastructure or services, right? The equipment that they use at the port itself. And in the new Tuas port, which will be operational by 2021, the first two berths, we are also encouraging our port operators, right, to install solar panels to support some of the energy needs, right, so that they will not be using too much of the fossil fuel. But in our next choice, in our next generation port in future, the entire port will be electrified. So what does it mean is that the energy that is being supplied to the port will either come from the generation companies that uses greener fuel that will produce low or zero carbon emission in the near future. Whether we are actually what is that? The next question is the deliver shop to produce other fuel. Okay, I think in the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore, we are also experimenting, or rather exploring or doing pilot trials. Other than using LNG, we are also moving towards other greener fuels such as methanol, biodiesel, as well as this ammonia, right? But having said that, I think LNG, we still view LNG as a transitional fuel beyond that will actually enable us to meet the what we call our carbon intensity goals, right? That we have committed to IMO by 2030. Right now, but it doesn't mean that we are not exploring other greener fuel. Now we are actually exploring, as what other speakers has mentioned, biodiesel, methanol, and ammonia, and ultimately even hydrogen beyond 2025 and 2030.
Thank you very much, Tham. Let's hear now very brief comments from our from the folks who have prepared their comments. Joshua Berger, do we have you with us?
Yes, hello there. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity and great discussion. I'm not going to necessarily weigh in on the technical aspects of fuels. I think from a U.S. and North American perspective, I think all that I would like to share is obviously we're going through a kind of important transition here in the U.S. and from my perspective in Washington State and Seattle, some of the work we're doing, I think what we're excited to see is a re-engagement in the global maritime decarbonization efforts in a number of different ways, and everything from R&D to uptake to exploring the infrastructure needs. We're looking forward to significantly more resources around the infrastructure necessary that's going to support global decarbonization, and as well as just the level of collaboration and organizing that's happening around it. That's within our federal agencies in the US, and our departments of energy and transportation and the like are getting organized around decarbonization in new ways, and certainly locally and regionally as well, and everything from supporting demonstration projects to supporting new technologies and commercializations of new technologies and founders. So strong network, excited to be engaged and part of the conversation on a global level. So that's all I have to share for now. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And indeed, we've had such lively presentations and good comments that we're almost running out of time. So we'll keep these comments short. But Thomas Hechman, are you with us? perhaps a brief comment from you as well.
I am indeed. Thank you very much. I was just asked here to give a few comments on the possibilities that the organization I represent, Maritime Denmark, is facilitating. Basically, very shortly, Denmark as a big maritime organization, we obviously recognize that these challenges we face in the future can only be solved if we stand together. And I think the SEA20 initiative is a good example of people teaming up, realizing that we all depend on standardized solutions that we need to develop and create together. And that's why in Denmark, all the cluster and network organizations will, from 1st of January 2021, consolidate into one big super cluster called MARLOC, which is short for Maritime and Logistics Innovation Denmark. And we will be one point of contact into basically all the Danish knowledge institutions, meaning universities and technological institutes, as well as basically most of the companies representing the entire maritime industry, as well as logistics, from SME segment all up to the very big Danish companies that you all know, such as AP Møller and DSV and the likes. So what I can facilitate is simply if you have any needs to get in contact with anyone from Copenhagen or Denmark, and you don't have a way in or a network existing, you can always reach out to MARLOC, and we will be able to help you facilitate that contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And we have very short time for Lucy Gillim. I think I've seen Lucy already comment on the chat, so hopefully people have been following the chat conversation as well. But Lucy, briefly a comment, I believe, on LNG.
Yeah, I thought I'd get my comments in the chat just in case you couldn't get to me. But yeah, I just really wanted to highlight the dangers of taking the wrong path and LNG and biofuels actually not getting us to our climate targets. So they give the illusion now that we might be doing something good for the environment. But when you dig into it, you find out that because of the methane slip from engines and supply chain, you're not actually saving emissions. LNG, methane, is a very potent greenhouse gas, especially in the short term over a 20-year span. And we really need to be rapidly reducing emissions now in order to be saving our carbon budget. So I would say we need to be investing in the solutions that really get us to zero. We've got a huge challenge ahead, and we need regional industrial energy policy to support that transition for shipping. And that's why we need to also have regulations at a European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Juha Kytölä, from industry perspective, would you like to comment?
Yes, I would like to comment. Thank you for the opportunity. So I agree with the viewpoint that we don't have the final solution at hand at this moment, but actually the biofuels and also the starting synthetic fuels help us in the transition, and we need solutions for the transition as well. If we just sit and wait until the final solution is here, then we are too late for sure. So we need to see this development as an evolution at the same time when we are really all working for the final solutions as well. So natural gas is not a solution, but it can help us in the transition like other solutions as well.
Anu, I think you might be muted.
Always muted and covered by little signs showing that people are commenting, which is very good that people are commenting. Thank you so much. Since we're running out of time, we will look at your comments, we will collect them, and we will see if we could get some of our speakers give us short answers, and we could share them via email with you so the conversation can continue. On the chat, I have also shared a link to the LinkedIn group for the SEA20 initiative where we could continue the conversation. So please join and we will accept you as a member and we can keep discussing. We could just show the briefly next slide. I also included in the chat a link to a very brief questionnaire on maritime decarbonisation that might help us prepare for next year on SEA20 and next year's call. So if you have at all time please take the 1 to 2 minutes, it's very short, to share your views with us. And the plan for now, if we take the next slide, is to have the next SEA20 call mid-February and focus on maritime decarbonisation and investments. Thank you everyone so much for joining. Risto, did I leave anything out? I don't think so.
No, you did a perfect job. Thank you.
Perfect job. Great conversation. Thank you, everyone. And let's continue the conversation online and next year on these calls. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And just to say, I'm quite happy to help if anyone has any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John.